y'all. Get ready to saddle on up and come with me on a journey. A journey through some very tall peaks and some very low valleys. Let's trot on down to the OK Corral of books where I shall air my grievances. Where some of these books should go to just feel bad about what they've done. Finally, we'll finish at the Real Good Ranch, where the books have more stars than a sheriff's deputy. Wow, I really committed to that theme. Let's roll the intro. It's Leanne and welcome back to another video. If you are new here, my tops and bottoms is the way that I wrap up my previous reading month by telling you only about the loftiest highs and the why am I hereiest lows. And for once, I am thrilled to say that we do not have an even number. No, in fact, we have more tops than we have bottoms this time around. And I genuinely can't believe the last time that we had a tops and bottoms where there were so many things to talk about that I was like, I need to talk faster. Like, as a Scottish person, I need to go double speed because there's just so many goodies to fit in. But before we go any further, I would like to talk about some other goodies. The goodies provided by the sponsor of today's video. Because today's video is sponsored by HelloFresh. I have talked to you guys before about HelloFresh in some detail. Because as one half of a chronically ill couple, sometimes feeding ourselves is literally the hardest thing that we have to do. You know, after you've done all of the business of the day stuff, the actual business of being alive stuff can be really, really complicated. And HelloFresh just cuts down on all of that. HelloFresh is essentially a meal subscription service. You tell them how many meals that you need from them a week and they provide you with beautiful menus that you can scroll through from the convenience of your couch. And then when you've decided what delicious things that you would like to eat, they will put it all in a box for you and send it to your doorstep. No last minute online shops here. No turning up at your local supermarket half dead and looking for inspiration midweek. HelloFresh takes care of all of the faff of cooking. And the thing that I really like about them is that there is so little waste because you literally only get enough of each thing to use in the dishes that you are making. There is, for example, no buying entire jars of spices or sauces that you're only going to use a little bit of because you never know if you're going to like something until you've tried it. Honestly, HelloFresh just has everything. Value for money and peak convenience. So if you would like to check out HelloFresh, then you can scan my handy dandy code here to get 60% off of your first box and then 25% off of your next 8 boxes. That's money off 2 months worth of meals, guys. If I didn't already get HelloFresh, I might use that code myself. If you can't scan the code or you need more information, then there is a link down below in my description box that you can clicky click, because again, everything about HelloFresh is nothing if not convenient. Which conveniently brings me on to my first book. I know, guys, there's a lot of brain fog going on today. Let's just go with it. Alright, so the first book up on this list isn't actually just one book. It is in fact 6 books. Because I reread the entire Lock and Key graphic novel series in August and I am so glad that I finally did it. The reason that I ended up picking up this series and rereading it this month is because I am now making a concentrated effort to get through the series that I listed on my series tracker video. When I did my series tracker video, I identified a toxic trait that I have. I mean, I already knew that it hung about the edges in a few places, but I didn't realise how many series this actually applied to. But when I get to the last book in a series, I develop issues. Sometimes I don't want to read that final book in a series because there's been a gap since it's been published and my brain goes, well, in order to read this you need to reread all of the books in this series, even though guys, one of my superpowers is an almost perfect memory for things that happen in the books that I read. So the chances are I know everything that happened in that series if I read it in the last like 10 years. And I don't in actual fact need to reread it all to read the last book, it's just that my brain tells me that I should. One of the other annoying things that I do with final books is that I keep them for a rainy day. So I'm like, oh, it's the final book in that series, I should keep that for a really, really special time. And then that special time is never. There is never a special time. There is no such thing as keeping books for a rainy day. I live in Scotland, 90% of the days are rainy. And then finally, there is the most annoying thing I think that I do, which is that I get to the end of a series, particularly if it's a long series, and I'm like, but it's the last book. I don't want that to be the last time that I see those characters. Who knows when this author will write another book? Maybe it'll end up being like Lockwood & Co, where I love that series passionately with my whole heart, but then everything else that the author brings out I actually hate. How awful would that be? And it's just so problematic because there's just so long that you can hide from spoilers of your favourite series. Eventually, particularly if they're not brand new, they are going to come up in casual conversation at some point, like, oh, you love that series, what do you think of this ending? Trust me, it's happened to me before. And so I popped a square on my bingo board over one of the defunct squares that I was not using, which forced me to pick up books from my series tracker. And the first series that I picked to finish off was the Lock and Key series by Joe Hill and Gabrielle Rodriguez. So the Lock and Key series is about the Locke family. We are following teenagers Tyler and Kinsey and 6-year-old Bodhi as they happily navigate their life at the start of the series, living with their mum and their dad, who is a guidance counsellor at Tyler and Kinsey's school, and just trying to navigate the business of being teenagers and the cringe that is having your dad be involved in all of the pastoral care in your high school. When all of a sudden one summer, one of the kids that Mr. Locke was counselling through some really difficult circumstances in his life breaks into their family cabin and brutally kills Mr. Locke. Feeling in the wake of this, the family move back to Key House, which is the Locke family's estate in a tiny little coastal town called Matheson in Massachusetts. But once the kids get to the house and everybody is sort of moved in, the youngest kid, Bodhi, who I freaking love, Bodhi is literally one of my favourite characters ever. He starts to find literal keys in Key House, and every single one of those keys does something highly unusual and magical and massively dangerous. It turns out that maybe their dad's murder wasn't actually all that random, and that maybe it was to do with the keys. Something that their dad as a teenager knew all about and took pains to try and make sure nobody else found. I mean, look, there's no getting away from it. Lock and Key is a cult graphic novel series, and there's a reason for that. Because while every issue is really pacey and is filled with tons of tiny little mysteries that leave you like breadcrumbs throughout all of the chapters until you suddenly turn a page and you're like, oh my god, that person is actually that person who's connected to that person, oh my god. Or you turn a page and you're like, get away from my kids! Because I dare you to read this series without getting so deeply protective over these kids. Like, I actually dare you. And I know that it's the twists and turns that bring a lot of people in, and the horror readers who like the weird things that happen in Key House, because again, Key House and the town of Matheson are indeed like place as character in these graphic novels. There's no way that you don't get a sense that Key House is in some way sentient and is in some way pushing Bodhi to find these keys. The house has seen so much history and so many generations of the Locke family, and it knows things. And there's no getting away from the sense of foreboding that the town of Matheson itself has, like it's constantly just holding its breath and waiting for the end of a chapter to happen. But yeah, there is all of that, and I know that that's what brings in a lot of readers and why people love this series a lot. And don't get me wrong, I love all of those things too. You guys know that creepy houses and that tiny creepy coastal towns are very much in my wheelhouse. But the reason that I love this series so much is the emotional complexity to it. If you had told me in 2015 when I originally read these, but also now, that I was going to get a 6-book graphic novel series that was going to take me on such an intricate grief journey through a family that's kind of pulling itself apart from the inside and yet also desperately reaching for each other to try and be close, then I would not have believed you. Because the format of graphic novels kind of traditionally usually lends itself to more short form and therefore sometimes less nuanced perspectives on stuff like this. But this series just knocks it out of the park. Like, I have absolutely no trouble whatsoever hearing those kids in my head when they're talking to their friends and when they're talking to each other, when they're reacting to each other, because a lot of their grief is sort of compounded by the fact that because their mother is drinking so much, they are on their own. They only really have the three of them to hold on to, and they all have such complex PTSD about their dad's death, about the way that it happened and the way that their life was kind of ripped away from them in the wake of it, that it's just so freaking rewarding to watch them navigate that with each other. Like, safe in the knowledge that no matter what bad thing they do, they all love each other, and that fact is not disputed. But on top of the kids and the amount of love that I have for them, this series also has a bunch of side characters that I absolutely fell in love with. There is a queer subplot in these graphic novels, which, given the fact that they were originally published from like 2008 onwards, is actually handled in a really nuanced and lovely way, especially given the age and very visual differences of the couple that are involved in that relationship. It's beautiful and I love it. I read all of these graphic novels on live sprints with my patrons, and finishing them was so emotional. I am seriously and sincerely not okay. So much so that I am now going to be moving on, of course, to finally watching the Netflix series, which I have sampled, and the kids are not necessarily the kids as I see them in my head, but that's okay. And I'll be listening to the Audible dramatisation of this, because all of these graphic novels have been done in a multicast audio format and just one like big episode that includes the talent that is Kate Mulgrew. I'm not okay, but I am very proud that this series will be able to come off my series tracker next time I do an update on that. Alright, back to the tops from this video, and I want to tell you about one of my most anticipated books for 2023, which, when it hit my doorstep, I had to stop myself from ravenously ripping apart from the packaging and just reading there in my hallway. And in retrospect, I'm kind of glad that I didn't do that, because I ended up also picking this book up on audiobook, and that was absolutely the way to go, because the audiobook production of this is phenomenal. The book that I'm talking about is None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. Now, you guys know that Lisa Jewell is one of my favourite thriller authors. I have just eaten through her books at a rate of knots. So to say I was excited for this one was a bitty bit of an understatement, and I think I have told you guys enough about it that you probably know the synopsis off by heart, but I'm gonna give it a go anyway, just in case you haven't, because if you haven't, you should. None of This Is True is about two women, Alex and Josie. They meet by pure chance in a restaurant one day because they are both celebrating their birthdays. A few days later, they bump into each other on the street again because they actually live pretty close to each other, and Alex is hit by an idea, because Alex is the podcast host of a pretty famous podcast about women who have really taken their lives into their own hands and have become massively successful after coming from really, really difficult situations. But that series is now over. Alex has done her last episode of it, and she's now looking for something that she can do another series about, something which will inspire people that is a little bit unusual. And she hits upon the idea of doing a birthday twin series, where she and Josie look at being born on the same day and how their lives have massively diverged. But what Alex does not realise is that Josie is not just an average person. Josie is a person with a ton of secrets, and once they bumped into each other at that restaurant, Josie immediately started researching Alex, and their meeting on the street was not entirely by accident. And before Alex knows it, Josie has infiltrated almost every aspect of her life, but in such an insidious way that she both doesn't know how she could get rid of her, but also doesn't know why she wants to get rid of her, and feels like she's being a really mean and inconsiderate person by not wanting Josie around so much. And obviously, because it's Lisa Jewell and it's a thriller, things get very complicated from there on in. I just did not expect what this book did, which is very typical for Lisa Jewell. I don't feel like she does a lot of the same sort of recycled thriller tropes that you see everywhere else. But the one thing that links all of her books together for me are her characters. She has a very distinct way of writing a character and usually having at least one of the characters in that cast being completely ignorant of everything and actually just being a fairly nice, normal, average person who has been dragged into this massive mystery which has landed on their doorstep. And I really, really love that. Like, all of our characters really feel like fully formed people to me from the minute that they walk onto the page. And like any other Lisa Jo book, this book has a lot to say on a lot of different things. And there are massive trigger warnings for this book. It does deal with domestic abuse, it deals with alcoholism, it deals with coming from an impoverished background, it deals with a massive age difference in a romance, which was really, really interesting as all of the different layers got added to the way that this couple got together, and you saw all of the nuanced perspectives from lots of different people who all had different opinions on whether they should have been together or whether it was problematic or whether it was actually bordering on like illegal and immoral. But one of the things that I found so interesting about this was the commentary that it had on being polite, because a lot of the things that Alex goes through in this book with Josie could have been avoided if she had just decided to be impolite in any one of the situations that happened before we get to like a turning point where things can't go back. Like, if Alex had just decided to be like, actually no, I don't want to do that, I'm sorry, I want you to leave, instead of being worried about offending Josie or being worried about how people saw her or being worried about being so pushy, she would have in fact been safer. And it was a really subtle, nuanced discussion of what society expects women to accept, because in this book the men who were involved were able to protest and say things weren't okay on multiple occasions, but because the main characters, the main dynamic was these women who did not want to offend anybody, who did not want to hurt anybody's feelings, there was the consistent prioritizing of somebody else's comfort over their own, to the point where Josie really took advantage of knowing that Alex would not do anything which would outwardly look like it would be harmful to somebody else or hurtful to somebody else in any way. And so in that, it also became a discussion about how women take advantage of that like patriarchal imperative that has been put on other women, so how we also perpetuate this system. It was just so smart, it was so intensely smart and so uncomfortable. There were so many moments where I just felt disgusting in this book, where I was like, oh, no, please make it stop. And there is also a trigger warning for stalking in this book, because that is essentially what Josie does, how she infiltrates Alex's life. And I was just so gripped by it. I was so gripped and so creeped out by the little individual things that she did that didn't actually look that harmful, that just looked a little bit neurotic from the outside, but from the inside it was like, oh, it was just so good. And I'm so glad that I picked it up so quickly and didn't leave it for a rainy day book. And I don't think you should either. If you like thrillers, or you have liked any Lisa Jo books in the past, or you like the thrillers that I like, then I say run and pick this one up. Ooh, next up on the bottom we have actually got a thriller that I did not like. This is A Certain Kind of Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers, and it is essentially a book about a female cannibal. The main character, Dorothy Daniels, is a food critic. She's quite a famous food critic. She's on TV. She has cookbooks out, that kind of thing. And her whole background, coming from like nothing in the countryside, just this little country bumpkin girl, to being this person who's in all of our living rooms, is like a very sort of national consciousness story. But Dorothy is actually a serial killer. Specifically men who have wronged her, or men who used to be her lovers, etc. and so forth. Look, you guys know that I am a fan of a certain kind of female protagonist, the kind of character that appears in books like Sweet Pea and Jane Doe, who is herself sociopathic, who is maybe a serial killer, who is a complete villain and is allowed to be that person and is allowed to do whatever they want, and who gets the kind of monologue who would usually only be reserved for male characters. And sometimes those books are very tongue-in-cheek, like Sweet Pea and Jane Doe, where you're also kind of laughing while you're being horrified. And sometimes they're so much darker and more complicated and more to do with trauma, like they are in All the Birds Singing by Evie Wyld, for example. Like, for me, there's a lot to be said for those kinds of books. This one somehow managed to fit into neither category while trying to take a big swing at doing both of them at the same time. And it did not hit. This book has the kind of writing which I would describe as deliberately grotesque and crude in a way that isn't fun. I mean descriptions which are deliberately really deeply overwritten, and especially in a book like this one which features food so much, there's obviously a lot of like correlation between food and dismembered body parts, and the descriptions are really just there to show you how like gritty and grim that this book is willing to be, rather than actually moving the narrative forward in any way or giving you any new information about the character. And while in all of the other books that I've read that kind of come into this category, there are layers to the book. So you usually go in knowing that this character is like a self-confessed sociopath, or like they know their actions aren't socially acceptable but they can't bring themselves to care, like that kind of thing. But then as time goes on, you see different layers building into their narrative about where they came from and how they got to this place. You usually actually do feel very deeply about some handfuls of things. For this character, I didn't feel any of that. There was no like gentle little threads that the author was pulling. It was all just really obvious and really just in your face from the minute that she walked on the page. I still don't really know how to describe the atmosphere that pervades this book, except that it kind of sucks all of the joy out of itself and all of the joy out of reading it. I mean, the main character isn't meant to be somebody who we fall in love with. She's not meant to be somebody who we're like rooting for, which is fine because she doesn't need to be. There are plenty of books I have read in the thriller genre which have unlikable characters that you are not rooting for and yet you cannot stop reading about them. But this character is unlikable to the point where I was just like, why am I here? The author just took such pains to make the character so despicable and to make her motives like so unsupportable that I was just like... And to top it all off, there was so much fluff in this book. There were so many details in it that was clear that the author had just like researched stuff for this book and she was determined it was going to be in this book. Because the main character is like a food critic and in the food world, there were so many things about like the laws behind food and really weird random facts about how food is grown and all that kind of stuff. And I really came off feeling like I knew what the author wanted this book to be, but she couldn't quite get it there. She had all of the component parts, but she didn't really know how to stitch them together in a way that made it compelling enough for me to want to keep going, and so I didn't. Alright, so next up is a book that was compelling, that was in fact so compelling that I finished it ridiculously quickly. That book is of course our next top, and it is Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. This book was one of my Patreon book club picks, and oh boy, did they pick a doozy. I was absolutely obsessed with this book from the first page because it somehow manages to be both a creepy kind of vaguely haunted house horror book whilst also being a book about what happens when you've had a serial killer in your family and the complex trauma of coming from a person like that who you both love but also revile, which is a little kind of like niche place that I really love to visit after having that question ignited in my head by Stillhouse Lake, which is, by the way, one of my favourite thriller books of all time. Because like in Stillhouse Lake we've got a family whose father has also been convicted as a serial killer, and then they're in like witness protection and they're trying to make a new life, and it just keeps pulling them back in. And in Just Like Home we've got a main character who grew up in a house which her father was essentially using as a place to kill and torture his victims. A lot of the times while she was actually in the house and just not understanding what any of the noises were or what was going on, and who after having been found out was still in her brain her dad. And Vera at the beginning of this book hates herself. She hates herself for loving her dad, but she also hates herself from running away from the small town that she grew up in. She hates that she can't bring herself to change her name, but she also hates that as soon as people hear her name, eventually somebody makes a connection to the case and asks her about it, and she then needs to move on. She hates that knowing everything that her dad did means that she can't see her childhood in the way that it was in her mind anymore. And I find that really interesting because I have also had that experience in my life of like a parent doing something so traumatic that it then rewrites every good memory that you had before that, and you no longer see yourself or your own narrative in the same way. And the way that that was discussed in this book was just genius. this. And I got something wrong when I was telling you guys about this book in my TBRs and stuff before I picked it up, because the synopsis is a little bit misleading. So at the beginning of this book, Vera gets a call from her mother to come back to Crowder House because her mother is dying. So it wasn't her father that was dying the way that I was led to believe. Her father has in fact died many years before. It is actually her mother. And Vera and her mother do not have a good relationship. They do not like each other at all, and they never have. But Vera finds herself compelled by like duty to go back to the house because it's all going to be hers after her mother dies, and she has to figure out what she's going to do with it, because her mother has turned Crowder House into a kind of memorial to her father's crimes. Like, she has put perspex down over all of the carpets, so the carpets are preserved exactly as they were when he was in the house. Rooms are kept exactly the way that they were so that guests can come and stay in them, stay in like the serial killer's house and experience things as they were when he left them there. And her mother also has a resident artist come in every now and again who is allowed to kind of use the house as inspiration for their works. And there is an artist in residence when Vera gets to the house who she very, very much does not get along with from the minute that he walks onto the page. But as soon as Vera gets back to the house, the complex trauma of having grown up there means that she starts to see things, she starts to experience physical symptoms, and then she starts to find notes that are there in her father's handwriting, except they can't be her father's handwriting because he is dead. There was just such a sense of something is deeply, deeply wrong here now. Not like this place has been used for horrible things so you really shouldn't be in it, but like now, right now, this place is still doing deeply, deeply horrible things and you need to leave. That the reader has that Vera doesn't have. You have this sense of like, oh no girl, please turn around, while she is just kind of blindly walking into this situation feeling like she has no choice, and feeling that like there is nobody on her side, there is nobody to keep her safe, there's nobody looking out for her. The entire town reviles her family, and in fact when she goes into the town there is somebody who's like, I hope the whole house burns down with you guys in it because I want it to be gone. It shouldn't exist anymore. Like, the level of hatred that she experiences from people and also for herself in this book is harrowing. And honestly, Vera has come into a category of very specific heroines in horror novels who I absolutely love and just would go to bat for. Characters like those in The Family Plot by Cherie Priest or The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. A very kind of specific, slightly sarcastic, very lost but very self-possessed character whose inner monologue just makes you absolutely fall in love with them while also being like, what is going on here? So yeah, I absolutely loved this one. I can't tell you anything more about it because everything past this point is like a massive spoiler, but it was so twisty, so oppressive in the kind of way that I would describe Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn as also being like really oppressive. Actually, that's a very good comparison. If you like this one, then you're probably gonna like the atmosphere in this one. Yeah, I totally loved it and I want to read more from this author immediately. Alright, on to the last bottom on my list. We'll just sweep all of those out of the way so we can get to the final top. The last bottom on my list is very sadly I Want to Eat Tteokbokki But I Want to Die by Baek Se-hee. This is the author's experience of being diagnosed as having a depressive disorder which essentially makes you just a little bit depressed all of the time. So not entirely ever able to like shake that feeling off, just like walking through the world knowing that everything is a little bit sad and that everything feels a little bit pointless and not being able to break away from that. And what then happens when she goes to a therapist to kind of talk through all of these thoughts and feelings that she's having related to her condition and how she sees herself as a person. And the book is pretty much in the format of getting a little bit of information about what you're going to be told about in the chapter and then a transcript of the author's therapy with their therapist. So you're getting a sort of transcript of the two of them chatting to each other and working through some of these ideas that the author is having about her life. And my main takeaway from this book was How for a book that is so incredibly short do I feel like I have been here for years? So let me make myself incredibly clear here. I am not saying that this book is not necessarily an important book, because I think for some people it definitely could be. For some people who are only just allowing themselves to admit that they might have mental health struggles, for people who culturally come from a background where they don't feel like they can talk about mental health struggles, where it's very much frowned upon, where you're supposed to just kind of like get on with it and be a person. For people who are at that stage in their mental health journey, I think this book could be quite important. I think it could also be quite important for people to be able to see the author allowing herself to be portrayed as really quite unlikable, because when you go into therapy sessions with your therapist, you are in a completely safe space where you can say anything about anybody and in any way that you want to, and you don't really have to consider the emotional impact that it might have on people. So it does make you look kind of inherently selfish and like a little bit of a shit person if that is sort of seen from outside of that bubble. And I think that would be the same case with any of us who would have like our therapy transcripts published, as we try to sort of work through how we feel in relation to other people. And I think it might be important for some people to be able to see that it's okay to be complex, that it's okay to have various different mirrors held up to yourself. So I am in no way saying that this book couldn't be like vitally important for some people. But for me, who has both been through therapy in a lot of different ways in my life and at a lot of different times, and who is also much further forward, I think, in my sort of mental health journey, I felt like this book was quite tedious. I felt like it really did kind of rehash the exact same points over and over again, because fundamentally, again, that is what therapy is. You're taking a concept about yourself, like a truth that you hold to be true about yourself, and you're like slowly picking it apart, and it can take like a lot of repetition of that message for you to break that down in your head and to get over that. But while that might be really interesting when it's your own issues, like if you were to look back at them in a transcript format, I don't find it really that interesting to hear about other people's issues in the same way. And I think that's the issue, because this wasn't like a nuanced sort of memoir where there was a lot of narrative from the author, where she was kind of saying like, okay, here are the things that were going on in my real life at the time, here was what happened this night, oh, after I had this session I then had this revelation which then led to this interaction. Because you're not getting any of that stuff, because you're only getting the bare bones of the therapy that she went through, it kind of feels really one-dimensional, and like I couldn't get close to her, and like I just couldn't find any way to actually get invested in the things that she was going through. So I think this one for me is a case of like a missed opportunity. I would have preferred that this be a fully fleshed out memoir, because I've read quite a lot of memoirs like that which deal with people's differing mental health issues in like a lot of different complex ways. I have really enjoyed memoirs like that in the past, and I feel like if this one was in that format, if there had been more narrative, more exploration, more context given, that I would have absolutely loved it. But because it is a very like short form, very redacted, very stilted kind of back and forth just with the author and her therapist, it just didn't hit those depths for me, and it wasn't for me. So yeah, I think this book is like it wasn't for me because it wasn't in a format that I particularly like to consume people's stories in. So maybe if that is the kind of thing that you're looking for, if you're looking for like a primer about mental health and depression and therapy, then this might be good for you. And I can see why the book was initially quite revolutionary for the author when it was in its original language, because I think that culturally it would have been very important to show that side of yourself. So again, if that is something that might interest you, then I think go for it. But for me, it was a miss, and I've already unhauled it, which is a shame because I really was anticipating this book quite a lot. And the last one that I absolutely won, that I won in a big way, was Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. Now, I have talked a lot about the Red Rising trilogy since I started it last month. Like, I am aware, I hear myself. I cannot be stopped, because I cannot remember the last time that I picked up a new series and that I wanted to just read it back to back, one after the other, and like finish as much of it as I can. And that is very much what's happened with this series. It has gripped me so tightly that I'm like, no, the next book, no, I need the next book, no, I need the next book now. And quite honestly, I do think that this series is in the running to become one of my favourite series I have ever read, and I just didn't expect it to be so impactful. I did not expect to be so completely consumed with reading this series that I just want to tell everybody about it. Like, I want to tell everybody about it. So in case you haven't heard me talk about this story before, this is about Darrow. He is a miner under the surface of Mars, and he is one in a long generation of miners who live very short, very impoverished, very horrible lives mining for a precious resource called helium-3. Darrow and his people know that this substance, helium-3, is going to be used to terraform the surface of Mars so that all of the people from a dying Earth can finally be moved over to Mars and they can inhabit the planet. But Darrow's people also know that there's no chance that that's going to happen in their lifetime, so they're just mining for better hopes and better futures. But then one day something really, really detestably horrible happens to Darrow, and he is taken by a group of people to the surface, and he is shown that in fact Mars has been terraformed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and that Darrow's people are actually being kept as slaves below the surface, being fed sort of like propaganda of how they're saving people and saving Earth and how their sacrifice is not in vain. And Darrow, because he has pretty much nothing left at that point in his life, agrees to help to infiltrate the society that is in charge of all of this. It's a colour caste system, so Darrow is a red and the golds are the ones who run society, and Darrow agrees to infiltrate the golds in order to become one of them and to take that system down from the inside. And Red Rising was very much that book. Red Rising was very much like the setup book, the okay, we've found out that this thing has happened, how does this society work, what does their technology look like, how does Darrow infiltrate them, and then actually infiltrating them and watching that process happening. However, Golden Sun is what happens after that. And this is what I'm finding so interesting about this series, is that there are very real consequences happening as a result of Darrow starting to pull strings and pull this system apart. Like, there are consequences for people that he's come to love, as well as people that he reviles and people who he thinks are holding up this society in a horrible way. And there are no complete black and white areas in this series. Everybody is such complex shades of grey. Darrow does some horrifying things to achieve the ends that he feels like he needs to go to free his people. But also Darrow doesn't necessarily think very complexly about what is going to happen after that happens. Like, he doesn't go into it with a very politically orientated mind, and so he needs the people around him to help him to understand what it will look like when he pulls apart a society. Like, where do these people go? What kind of jobs do they get? Will there be homes for them? How do they eat? And so, like, there is a lot of discussion in this about what happens after the revolution, and we've not even got all the way through the revolution by the time we are in Golden Sun. And I love it. I love it so much, not just from like a social commentary point of view and actually finding a series in sci-fi or fantasy that does that, like What Happens After thing, because after the first trilogy, the next 4 books in the series, 3 of which have already been published, look at what happens after that thing has been ripped apart. So we kind of know going into it very much like, I guess you know that Katniss is going to change the way that the Hunger Games works, or by book 2 that we know that Fitz's actions are going to change the entire fabric of the Farseer universe. We know going into it that that's kind of going to happen, but waiting for that inevitable thing to happen does not guarantee outcomes. Pierce Brown has such a unique ability to make me fall in love with characters that I would otherwise just not want anything to do with. So usually when I read a series, I go into it and I usually kind of like the main character, but I'm like, whatever. And I end up getting invested in like a small amount of these side characters, the characters who just like show up every now and again to help the main character out, or who are their companions. And this book is not like that. I love Darrow. I absolutely love Darrow, but I love a whole host of the side characters, some of whom I don't think I'm supposed to love. And that's the problem in this book, is it doesn't matter who you root for, somebody will betray somebody else at some point. There are so many different threads and so many different moving parts in this, and you, because you're sitting in Darrow's driving seat, you are never really sure who's pulling any of the strings. Darrow isn't a politician, and so he's not 3 steps ahead of what's going to happen. He's not the Tyrion Lannister of the piece. He is the blunt sword of it all. And because of that, he gets invested in people and then is like wildly betrayed by them. So many people have died. Like, so many people are dead now. So many other people have done things that I'm like, why? One particular character, and again, I sent Becca a message when I was reading this because it is Becca's fault that I am reading this series in the first place, and I was like, if this happens to this character because of this thing, I am going to be so angry. And not only did it happen, but an extra like B plot happened that made it worse. And I'm still invested. I'm still like, Pierce Brown, just keep hurting me. Just keep hurting me because it feels so good. I don't know why. I don't know why. I genuinely can't remember the last time that I was this impassioned about a new series, and I'm just so glad that I picked this up off of the slag heap that was my TBR at the time. Like, genuinely, my series tracker has been so very good for me, even if it does make me feel so very bad about myself. So that's it, guys. Those were all of my tops and bottoms for the month. If you got this far through the video, then put the little rocket ship emoji down below in the comments, because everything forevermore is going to be a Red Rising reference. And don't forget, if you would like to get 60% off of your first box and then 25% off of your next 8 boxes with HelloFresh, then you can scan my code here or click my link down in the description below to take advantage of that offer. As always, please tell me if you have liked any of the books that I've talked about here today, or maybe if you hated them. And of course, if you have any recommendations for me based on the things preferably that I loved, down below. No recommendations based on the things that I hated unless it's an improvement on them, in which case give it to me. If you are new here and you are invested in my moral investment in the Red Rising series and you want to carry on with that with me, then hit that subscribe button. And if you like this video, then please don't forget to hit that thumbs up, because it really does help my channel. And I will speak to you really soon, guys. Bye!